Hello everyone. For this week's tutorial, I'd like to discuss making vector graphics from scratch using the pen tool, as well as vector-based filters such as GIMPressionist. I am starting in Photoshop/Photopia first because there is more pen tool options on there, whereas in GIMP you have only one pen tool option. There is also one other pen tool feature that exists in Photoshop but does not exist in Photopia, but we will get to that later. For now, let's start with the traditional pen tool. If you click and let go, you will create your first vector endpoint, formerly called an anchor point. If you click and let go at another point, it will connect those two in a straight line, like so. As long as you click and let go and do not move your mouse while you click, it will make as many straight lines as you want. However, if you were to drag after click rather than simply letting go, you would get a curve shape instead. This is actually what the pen tool is most commonly used for, and how it works is, it has 2 points on either end of the anchor point, called handles, and the further away you drag the handles, the more larger the curve gets. Note that you can also change the direction of the curve by rotating the handles, like so. However, after you have settled your handles, you cannot normally modify them. If you attempt to click, it will instead add an extra anchor point. However, if you hold Control and click, you will then be able to select the anchor point and move it. This is very useful if you have made a mistake with your anchor point and don't want it to be where you set it. The other styles are holding the Shift key, which makes the handles rotate only in 45-degree increments rather than freely rotating, and holding the Alt key, which creates a cusp. Or a triangular corner, depending on what you want to call it. You may have already noticed that as soon as you start drawing with the pen tool by adding your first anchor point, a new layer called Shape 1 appears. This is because it is a vector-based layer, rather than a raster-based layer like the ones we have been working with so far. However, you can use the pen tool to make a selection in the existing layer rather than creating a new layer by clicking the Path option. The Path option is actually commonly used to fine-tune selections, including selections that use curves, which would not be possible with a polygon lasso tool because it uses straight line segments only. Notice how in the shape mode there is a fill color and a stroke color, with no stroke being the default option. You can set it to pattern, gradient, or solid color much like the paint bucket. You can also change the stroke width, as well as how the selection guides appear. The last option is how the selection will add to the image. It can either unite with the existing image, subtract from the image, select intersecting areas only, or exclude. The next option that is exclusive to Photoshop is called the Curvature pen tool, which is called that because it will automatically determine the curve for you without prompting you to drag handles. In particular, if you click once to make an anchor point and then click anywhere else, it will automatically determine the features of the curve between those 2 points for you. And if you double click instead, it will make the straight line segment the way it works in the first pen tool. The last pen option, which Photopea and Photoshop has, is called the free pen, which works by instead of forcing you to draw anchor points individually and connect them, lets you draw curves freehand and will determine the path for you, like so. You may have noticed the tolerance option, which the default pen tool does not have, which will determine the level of smoothing it does for you after it follows the curve you selected, like so. Low tolerance, maximum tolerance. Notice how the curve keeps getting readjusted as I move the cursor. Just like the curvature tool, it has the same options as the regular pen tool. The only thing that's different is the way it allows you to specify the path. As mentioned in the Photopea/Photoshop portion of the tutorial, the GIMP pen tool is only the default pen tool. It does not have the other two options. The mechanics for the pen tool in GIMP work generally the same way as in Photoshop/Photopea, with clicking once without dragging, making a straight line segment, and clicking and dragging, adjusting it according to handles. The one thing that is different in GIMP is that you cannot click from the end point to the beginning point to close the path, because if you click the beginning point again, it will only move that particular point. However, you may notice that GIMP does not automatically fill or stroke your path for you the way it does with the shape option in Photoshop. And this is because there's a fill path and stroke path button provided for you that will automatically connect the last point to the first point, like so. The customization for the pen tool in GIMP works differently than the customization for the pen tool in Photoshop, with the default mode being Design, which creates the path. And you can also click Edit or hold Control to edit the points. And you can move the points or hold Alt to move the entire path. There's also an option to restrict your path to only polygons rather than curves. And besides fill and stroke path, there is an option to make a selection along the path. Notice how the selection option will automatically connect your last and first points together the way the fill and stroke do. The last thing I'd like to go over in this tutorial is the GIMPressionist filter, which you may recall me skipping when I taught filters in the 7th video. This is because whereas the other filters I taught use raster graphics, this one uses vectors much like the pen tool. In particular, you may remember it was under the artistic filters. Because of how compact it is, it has multiple tabs for multiple customizations, so that it can simulate many filters at once. In particular, I will break down these tabs one by one. The first tab is a list of presets, and these accumulate each preset you apply. Like so. The other tabs allow you to make more specific customizations if the presets are not to your taste. In particular, the paper tab applies a paper pattern over the image, with a scale slider determining how large the pattern is, a relief slider determining how solid the pattern will appear over the existing image, 100 meaning that the pattern will almost obscure the image, an overlay checkbox, which means the paper will be applied and blended similar to the overlay blending mode, and an invert checkbox, which means the darkness will become lightness and vice versa. Although the paper tab determines the general pattern, the next tabs, starting with the very next one, brush, determine how this pattern is applied more specifically. In particular, just like with papers, you can select from a list of brushes and scale the aspect ratio of the brush and the relief of the brush, which is similar to the relief on the paper tab. There is also a gamma slider directly beneath the brush, which means that the lower the gamma, the more the highlights will be emphasized, while the greater the gamma, the more the shadows will be emphasized. Like so. The next tab, Orientation, determines the orientation of the brushes in the overall image, or the orientation of the vectors the brushes will follow. In particular, there is a slider determining the total number of directions in the image, the starting angle and the angle span of the first brush/vector, and the orientation across the entire image, which can be based on the values in the image, the hues in the image, the radius value, and the radial value, which work slightly differently. In particular, the radius determines the vector for each stroke by calculating the distance from the center, without taking into account the direction, whereas the radial uses the direction but not the distance from the center. Random, which gives each vector a random direction. Adaptive, which attempts to adapt the direction of the vectors to match the original image. And finally, manual, which allows you to customize your own vector field. You can add vectors to the vector field, kill, which deletes vectors from the vector field, and select between vectors to move with the arrow keys right next to the Add button. As you select individual vectors, you can determine the angle of them, the angle offset, which rotates the entire field rather than simply the control vectors, the strength slider, which determines the magnitude or how much influence the vector has on the vector field, and the strength exponent, which determines the area of influence the vector has. You can also determine the type of vector field with the normal vector field, the first vortex option, which creates a sort of circular warp around each reference vector, vector 2, which creates a sort of pinched in look around each vector, similar to the shape of a trampoline, and vortex 3, which creates a looping sort of effect with vectors going out from the reference point on the top and then going back in on the bottom. The last option is Voronoi mode, which makes only the vector closest to the specified point have any influence, so that the area of influence is smaller. In the preview box where you add and modify vectors, there is also a brightness slider to allow you to preview the vectors more clearly against the background image as you turn down the brightness. Although creating your own vector field can be pretty hard to grasp at first, with enough practice, you can be able to create any effect you want. The next tab after orientation is size, with a slider determining the variations in size, a slider determining the minimum size, and a slider determining the maximum size. The checkmark options at the bottom work the same exact way as in orientation, including a checkmark to set a manual vector field. The next tab, placement, allows you to either randomly distribute the vectors or evenly distribute the vectors across the image. And you can also determine whether the strokes should be centered around the image and the density of each stroke. The next tab, color, determines whether you should average the colors onto the brush or make it distributed by the center of the brush, and also allows you to add noise. The final tab, general, has more general properties than the other tabs. You can change the background of the pattern, tell it whether to paint edges, check whether it is tileable or seamless, and check whether to add a drop shadow. The 5 slider options are Edge Darken, which allows you to determine how thick the shadows of the edges should be, Shadow Darken, which determines how dark the shadow should be, Shadow Depth, which determines how far away the shadow should appear, Shadow Blur, which determines how blurry the shadow should appear, and Deviation Threshold, which only works for adaptive vector fields and works by increasing the threshold of how much the adaptation should deviate from the original source. Although creating your own vector fields and all the options the GIMPressionist feature has besides that may seem overwhelming at first, It allows you to create many patterns without having to use other filters, so you can use that as a one go-to filter when you master it. Now that we have gone over creating vector art from scratch in both Photoshop and GIMP, we can move on to creating our own text fonts next week, as text uses vector-based graphics rather than pixel-based graphics. Although there exists software specifically designed for vector graphics, the professional version being Adobe Illustrator and its freeware alternative being Inkscape, we generally do not have to worry about using those types of software because the raster-based programs such as Photoshop and GIMP that we are currently working with have powerful vector tools with them already. However, if you are interested in learning Inkscape anyway, I have provided a link in the description of this video.
Don't forget to subscribe if you found this video informative, and make sure to visit the other tutorial videos and follow me on either Facebook or Twitter for more content.